people filter in. So we'll start in just about a minute or so. For those of you joining us now, we will start in about a minute. Just want to let some people filter in. We still have a few people coming, so we will start in very shortly. All right, I think it looks like we have a quorum for now. So good evening to those joining us in the US and good morning to those joining us in Asia. On behalf of 38 North and the Korea Defense Veterans Association, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event. I'm Jenny Town, a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of its 38 North program. Tonight is the launch of a new report that 38 North is publishing called North Korea's Checkerboard Threat: Obstacles and Opportunities for the US-ROK Alliance. And I'm sure many of our viewers have been watching North Korea's recent spat of missile tests with some sense of deja vu, as well as with great concern about what this means for South Korean defenses and US extended deterrence in the region, especially as Pyongyang advances such capabilities as hypersonic boost vehicles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. What we hear less about, though, is that it's not just WMD that North Korea has been working to advance, but conventional capabilities as well. North Korea showcased a whole new look to its conventional forces back in October 2020 during a military parade, where it also paraded around a new, larger ICBM. So, in this parade, everything from new uniforms and communications devices to small arms and artillery systems to main battle tanks and short-range air defense systems to new aircraft. This modernization process hasn't gotten much attention since that parade, and questions still loom about how much this new equipment is representative of new capabilities versus just parade props. But it's cause for concern for alliance planners in thinking through the possible new challenges posed by North Korea's military as a whole, not just their missiles. So the report we released this afternoon is in both English and Korean and can be found on the 38 North website. We'll drop links to in the chat as well for those of you on this call. But we thought it would be good to talk through some of the issues and recommendations covered in the report for the alliance managers to consider in light of this changing security environment on the Korean Peninsula. Before we start with our panel discussion, one housekeeping note is that there is translation interpretation if you need it. So there will be both English to Korean and Korean to English during the segment where we have one Korean speaker. So before we start with the panel discussion, I do want to welcome General Vincent Brooks, who co-chaired our working group for this research, to make a few opening remarks. And General Brooks is a career Army officer who retired from active duty in January 2019 as the 4-star general in command of the US Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and ROK US Combined Forces Command. He serves as chairman and president of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, KDVA. He is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from the US Military Academy at West Point, a Master of Military Art and Science from the US Army School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, and 2 honorary doctoral degrees, one from the New England School of Law and one from New England Law. So General Brooks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny. And let me just say up front how much I appreciate the partnership that we had with Stimson and 38 North. The Korea Defense Veterans Association has been honored to participate in this, and I am confident that we have something that will be of use for people to read, study, and contemplate, and then decide on their own from that. I'm very pleased that we were able to gather such a tremendous set of Korea watchers, experts, subject matter experts, authorities who have well-developed perspectives of this complex problem set. Everything from the alliance system itself to the challenges of trying to get North Korea to move in a constructive and positive direction. And as one can imagine, we have been doing this for several months, and each time we met, the circumstances were always in a slightly different place. So this was, without a doubt, trying to anticipate where the hockey puck was going to be next. Several things become very clear in this effort, and I think are worthy of note. And I won't try to summarize the report. I'd encourage all of you to do that, and we'll have some conversation about it here in a few minutes. But the alliance itself is what was relatively unchanged. There will be small inflections that happen in the alliance, given points in time, based on domestic politics, based on other issues. But the ironclad alliance is in place, and that is very, very important when it comes to having the right posture to approach an ever-changing North Korea and an ever-challenging regional environment. So we thought about those sorts of things. As we can appreciate, just within the last month, the circumstances have changed considerably. Are we re-entering 2017? I experienced that firsthand. I'm not so sure. There are some things that look like it, but we should be very careful not to presume a return to the past, but rather the entry into a new future that has some characteristics of the past. And looking for the things that are not the same, and the things that would reflect whether a door is open or closed, and pressuring those doors is really where we have to be thoughtful and mindful looking forward. So we want to encourage everyone to not fall into saw another ICBM, first one since 2017. Therefore, we're back in 2017 and picking up where we left off. No, a considerable amount of things have happened since then. And this could be a reflection of the start of a new course, which may or may not result in a constructive, positive outcome. And so we don't make a prediction about whether it will or will not, but the things that we have to think about is really where we concentrated our attention. Will North Korea yield its nuclear weapons, its nuclear arsenal, its nuclear capability? Will they stop testing? Will they stop developing? And will they disarm? Good question. One could presume that because of the aggressive acts of recent months, then certainly they will not, but it isn't certain. Particularly when coupled, as Jenny said, with the enhancements to conventional capability. What would a non-nuclear North Korea look like? Well, it will look very different now than it did in 2017 because it has been modernized in many ways, not to full scale, but certainly modernized in ways that reflects a change to the approach of the conventional capability. Is that enough to create a balance of power in the eyes of North Korea? Or must it be coupled with nuclear weapons? These are the kinds of questions that are out there. How do we get to a condition of denuclearization? Does it require a declaration of end of hostilities or does it not? Does it require increased pressure on top of the sanctions that already exist? Or is there another way? And I would certainly encourage us to always be looking for another way and not to presume that the frontal assault through conflict is the only way to get there. I personally don't ascribe to that. And I think that there are other options that always have to be explored first, while always maintaining the ability to do exactly that. And so this is where we've had discussions, and there are many implications for the Korea-US alliance. As long as it stays strong, I think that there's a good foundation to move in whatever direction is necessary. There's no question that with the election of a new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, in South Korea, that North Korea is now timing the ability to build some leverage, whether that's in advance of dialogue or in advance of trying to put pressure on the alliance, not clear yet. But clearly they're posturing now, recognizing this sensitive time period between the end of the Moon Jae-in administration and the start of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. How will the alliance respond? Which way will it go? And can it operate under pressure? My view is yes, it can. And North Korea shouldn't be surprised when it does. So all good things to think about, much behind us, much more in front of us. We appreciate you joining us tonight, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you, General. You always know how to set the context of a situation in such clear and compelling ways, and it's been a real pleasure working with you over the past year. Next, we have short opening remarks from General Ho-Young Lim. He is the president of the Korea Association of Military Studies, vice chairman of KDVA, and vice president of the Korea-US Alliance Foundation. Previously, he was the deputy commander of the ROK US Combined Forces Command from 2016 to 2017. And he served as the ROK Army's Director of Audit and Inspection and the Director of Strategy and Planning for the ROK Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Lim was called away for an important meeting with the incoming administration in Seoul, but has provided us with a short video greeting that we'll share with you now.
안녕하십니까. 한국군사학회 회장이면서 코드바 한측 부회장인 예비역 육군대장 이모영입니다. 먼저 오늘 이렇게 스팀슨 센터 산하 38로스가 그동안 2021년 여름부터 클린트 워크 박사와 나탈리아 슬레브니 그리고 리나 레그런 연구원 등이 군사 실무단을 편성해 북한의 점증하는 위협에 대응하기 위한 방법을 검토하고 한미 동맹에 건의하기 위한 연구가 마무리되어 이제 하나의 결과물을 내게 되었다는 것을 축하합니다. 저도 몇 번의 토의에 참가하여 함께 의견을 나누었는데 매우 유익하고 즐거운 시간이었다고 생각합니다. 특히 2016년부터 17년까지 한국에서 함께 연합사에서 근무했던 나의 파트너이자 현임이신 브룩스 사령관님과 함께 이 프로젝트에 참가하여 토의한 것은 저에게 매우 즐겁고 기쁜 일이었습니다. 이번 연구를 통해 북한의 위협을 체커보드 형태로 본 것은 매우 탁월한 분석이라고 생각합니다. 특히 기존 가정과 공세 종말점의 재정의, 전략적 전환과 전시작전 통제권, 민군 간 계획 및 정책의 연계성과 일상적 차원의 연합성 구축, 사이버 위협과 억제, 고정 인프라 취약점 해결, 방공 미사일 방어체계 통합, 영내 지정학적 고려사항 등 7개 분야로 나누어서 연구한 것도 매우 적절했다고 생각합니다. 저는 지난 40여 년간 군생활에서 기인지하고 있었던 그러한 분야도 있었지만은 이번 연구가 전혀 생각지 못한 그러한 분야도 많았습니다. 특히 전시작전 통제권 전환 조건의 모호성이나 한국군 장성, 특히 장차 미래 연합사를 지휘하도록 되어 있는 한국군 고위 장성의 연합작전 능력 향상을 위해서 공동 지휘 연습과 지휘 통제 체제를 개선하자는 내용이나 민군 간 정책 연계성과 전시뿐만 아니라 일상적 차원의 연합성 구축 노력과 연합훈련의 목표를 실패로 둔다는 것은 대단히 발상의 새로운 그러한 창의성이었다고 생각됩니다. 또한 사이버 위협의 분석과 대응책 등의 민간 연구가 정부 강요 등을 참가시켜야 하고 육군 동원사령부 개편을 통한 예비군 자원의 활용과 훈련 방식 개선 등은 한국의 저출산 추세와 연계하여 매우 필수적인 조치라고 생각이 됩니다. 아울러 고정 인프라 취약점 해소와 방공 미사일 체계의 연합 운용 능력 제고를 위한 부분적 통합 및 협조 등도 매우 돋보이는 방안이었습니다. 그리고 특히 지역 내 지정학적 고려사항을 분석해 한반도의 위기 상황과 대만 문제 등을 연계하여 대비책을 주문한 것은 매우 탁월하였으며 특히 지금 벌어지고 있는 우크라이나 사태까지도 고려해 보아야 한다고 생각했습니다. 결론적으로 이번 연구는 이제 새롭게 출발하는 한국 정부의 시작과 더불어 지난 5년보다 한미동맹이 더욱 중요하다는 것을 깨닫고 있고 앞으로도 한미동맹을 강화해야 된다는 인식이 증대되고 있는 시점에서 앞으로의 연합연습과 훈련은 강화될 것으로 예상됩니다. 이러한 시기에 또 시대적 전환기에 매우 적절한 그러한 연구였고 아주 유익한 그러한 결과물을 낳았기 때문에 새로운 한국 정부와 한미동맹 팀에게 이러한 내용들이 잘 전달될 수 있도록 최선의 노력을 제가 다하겠습니다. 지난 시간 이러한 훌륭한 보고서를 작성해 준 산팔로스 클린트 워크 박사, 나탈리아 슬레브니, 일리아나 레거넌 연구원에게 다시 한번 감사드리고 산팔로스 부회장인 미셸 케와 국장 제니 타운과 우리의 오랜 전우이자 주한미군 전우회 선임 부회장인 스티브 리에게도 감사합니다. 특히 연구의 좌장이시고 연구를 이끌어오신 브룩스 사령관님께 다시 한번 감사드리고 모든 분들의 노력에 진심 어린 존경을 보냅니다. 감사합니다.
Great. Thank you to both the generals for joining us tonight and co-chairing our working group and providing us with key insights throughout this research project. Moving to our panel, we're pleased to have with us tonight the report authors, as was mentioned before, and key participants of our working group to talk us through some of the salient points and recommendations. Our panelists include Dr. Clint Work, who is a fellow here at 38 North. Prior to joining Stimson, he was an assistant professor at the University of Utah's Asia campus in South Korea and the regular foreign policy writer for the Diplomat magazine's Korea page. His work focuses on the Korean Peninsula, US-Korea relations, East Asia, and US foreign policy, and he is currently engaged in research on the history and evolution of the US force presence on the Korean Peninsula and US-ROK alliance transformation in the post-Cold War era. And for those of you who tuned in last week, you got to hear some of that research. Our panelists also include Lieutenant General Chun In-bum, who is president of the Association of the United States Army Korean Chapter and advisory member of the National Bureau of Asian Research, who also serves as the vice president of the MiG-Ally chapter of the US Air Forces Association. He previously served as the chief of the Election Support Branch, Civil Military Affairs Strategic Operations Directorate at the Multinational Force in Iraq, the director of US Affairs at the Korean Ministry of National Defense, and was also involved in negotiations and cooperation with the US on the relocation of US forces, camp returns, US-ROK Joint Vision Study, Special Measures Agreement, and the transition of the wartime operational control. He also commanded the 27th Infantry Division and was the senior member of the UN Command Military Armistice Commission. And finally, on our panel is also Natalia Slavny, who is a research associate and assistant editor for 38 North. And her research experiences and interests include humanitarian aid, international law, human rights, inter-Korean relations, US-DPRK relations, and the US-ROK alliance. So we're really pleased to have the three of you here with us tonight and to bring the wealth of information and experience that you have to the discussion and to the report itself. So let's dive into the report. I think while there's a lot of publicity, of course, on North Korea's growing WMD programs, this project, as I mentioned before, is largely designed in response to new conventional capabilities that were seen in North Korea's October 2020 military parade, a significant improvement over what we've seen of hardware and weapons in the past, and which significantly increases North Korea's ability to wage urban warfare. So the question to the panel first is, do we have a sense of how those new capabilities are distributed throughout the KPA versus how much are for showcase or parade purposes? And then how does that assessment affect our alliance planning? And Clint, I'm going to turn to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Jenny. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, just first off, very quickly, thank you, Generals Brooks and Lim, for not only your welcoming opening remarks, but your involvement in the working group from from start to finish, and also to KDVA as a wonderful partner who we've worked with on this, but also previous projects too. And of course, my own team, who's integral to this whole effort. And last but not least, General Chen as well for joining us. Of course, there's no absolute certainty to this question you've posed, Jenny, but the group considered initially a range of low, medium, and high risk scenarios of North Korea's conventional developments as sort of a baseline for our discussion. And I'll just give a very brief overview of those three scenarios. So in the low risk scenario, KPA capabilities remained relatively stagnant, with modest improvements in conventional forces, enabling more effective military demonstrations and limited provocations. You might refer to this, Jenny, as sort of showcase plus. In the medium risk scenario, select KPA capabilities improved, with a qualitative gap growing between its most capable elements and much of the rest of the force. And so the KPA would possess increased lethality and improved capabilities suited to limited offensive operations by select units, as well as defensive operations. And then finally, in the high risk scenario, the KPA's conventional capabilities increased significantly across the board. And this included the ability to conduct more precise and lethal high intensity combat, at least for limited periods of time, and to inflict serious losses on high value equipment during defensive operations. However, when the group considered these low, medium, and high risk scenarios, it discussed factors that would, of course, limit the DPRK's capability developments and the degree of distribution throughout the KPA. And this included limits on design, on production capacity, resources and procurement, on integration, logistics, North Korean policies, its training, and command control and communications capabilities. And so considering these limitations, which of course all states have to navigate to one degree or another, the group consensus was that in practice, the threat would likely evolve in a quote unquote checkerboard manner, where some capabilities would remain low, others would reach a medium threat level, and still others a high level. And so that assessment, that checkerboard assessment, had several implications for alliance planning. First, sort of broadly speaking, was that the alliance should avoid simplistic thinking, like the low scenario is the best and the high scenario is the worst. Instead, the alliance should be prepared to use sort of counterintuitive logic, such that the DPRK's low-end capabilities could be used or employed for high-end effects. A second implication for alliance planning is that the alliance needs to think about how low to high-end capabilities are effective in different ways, depending on the quote-unquote fight at hand. And this includes an initial fight or provocation on or around the DMZ, a forward DPRK attack or mobile fight into ROK territory, or the DPRK's own defense against an alliance counterattack. So there needs to be sort of a cross-section or contextual component. When we think about the checkerboard threat, it can't be analyzed in a vacuum. It really has to, you have to look at the different implications depending on the fight at hand, so to speak. And a third implication for alliance planning is that the DPRK may not attack in a way that the alliance is prepared or trained for. And furthermore, that the battle space, and Jenny, you sort of alluded to this, will be really complicated and confused given its high population density and urban nature, within which civilian infrastructure would likely be targeted, and the DPRK could use a combination of low and high-end capabilities. So for example, rather than a full frontal offensive attack supported by concentrated artillery fire, North Korea could use its advanced missile capabilities alongside off-the-shelf unmanned aircraft systems or unmanned aerial vehicles to add complexity to targeting and air defense. And it could couple this with cyber capabilities and deep insertion of special operations forces or SOF units. So in this scenario, the alliance could find itself quickly running out of precision munitions and face very difficult questions about where to engage in this dispersed and confusing situation. So the alliance, rather than try to defend against every artillery round coming in, which of course is not possible, it's more important to determine how and why North Korea will use its forces. And then finally, and I'll pass after this, Jenny, a fourth implication for alliance planning is that due to the DPRK's likely inflexible C2 and limited logistical capabilities, the alliance should focus on forcing the North to culminate its offensive actions and fail logistically as quickly as possible to prevent it from generating momentum. Now, this does imply a degree of risk acceptance and potential escalation. So we did talk about that, but it was something that the group put out there to consider. So I've put a lot out there. I'll close for now.
And it is important to remember that this report was informed by a working group that met over the course of a year. I think we had about 4 or 5 meetings. So it's well informed by a number of military planners, defense policy, and broader regional and regional subject matter experts. General Chen, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think there's very little to add to Dr. Work's comments, but I just want to add in what I see into the question. So in the numerous parades that North Korea has displayed, I focus on 3 weapon systems that they have. And it is the Purse, the Firebird, which is the equivalent of a Russian-made Cornet, and the Hwaseumchong, which is the equivalent of an SA-16, like a Stinger, and the RPG rocket. And the reason that I focus on these is because what we're seeing in Ukraine, that a small country like Ukraine, well, not small, but relatively smaller than the Russians, are able to decimate the Russian tank and air force with these types of weapon systems. So if you look at the North Korean parades, these weapon systems are everywhere, in trucks, in tanks, in APCs, in their tells, and it's displayed with every unit, even the Red Guard units, the labor Red Guard units, which is equivalent to your local neighborhood, militia. So whether they have it or not, it's unclear, but clearly they want to show that they have a lot of them. So that's number 1. Number 2, we know for a fact that these weapons are within military units. So the North Koreans are afraid that some disgruntled civilian group will attack a weapons cache and start a revolt. So they have these weapons within military units for safeguard. It comes to reason that probably because of this, it's not very accessible to the civilian population, but still there must be training going on. Third, if you're familiar with the BBC documentary, The Mole, it clearly shows that North Korea is capable of manufacturing and exporting these types of weapon systems. So for us preparing for that kind of challenge, it would be prudent to prepare for the worst. So I think we should take a good look at how these man-portable weapon systems can be a big challenge to the current South Korean and alliance weapon systems that we have. Now, for the American tanks and aircraft, I feel they know that the challenge, and they've been training. They have tactics and they have the equipment to counter this threat to a certain level. Unfortunately, I'm not that comfortable about the South Koreans. And because of this, if we're in a fight, we're only going to be as strong as our weakest link. So that's my biggest concern. Dr. Work mentioned this, but the drones are not shown in the parades recently. They were shown until the early 2000s, but suddenly they disappeared. Now, we all know that Kim Jong-il had a special interest in drones. So why aren't they not being shown anymore? Have the North Koreans decided that drones are not needed. I think they are developing a family of drones that will really be able to embarrass the alliance in a limited situation. So drones should be given more attention to. Additionally, electronic warfare capability of the North Koreans. And what I mean by electronic warfare capability, especially jamming. Very easy to jam our GPS signal, very easy to jam our communications, especially the satellite communications. So if they were smart, which they are, the next time they provoke or create a provocation, they're going to jam our communications. But what's more concerning is that North Korea has realized that communications is a weapon. They know that by having good communications, it is a force multiplier. Unfortunately, the South Koreans still think that communications is a nice thing to have. And unless we get out of this kind of mentality, nobody's going to know, where their friendly forces are. Nobody's going to be really sure of the situation, and the fog of war will be confounded. So the planners needs to look at this. Now, at the higher level, CFC, at the theater level, we just give broad guidance, but this has to be drilled down to the tactical level, to the person level, so that the person, the soldier, is able to cope with these kind of challenges. And I think, that's very important. And that's where a lot of the neglect is in the alliance right now. And that's an area where American leadership just can't see, because they're more focused on the theater level and the operational level. Thank you.
Thank you, General Chun. And it's interesting that you brought up drones, as this is one of the areas in which Kim Jong-un did identify in his 8th Party Congress speech as needing to develop more. And I think we probably will see more of that in the coming months and years. I think a few of your closing points in this question lead us into our second question. And that is really, based on this checkerboard threat assessment, how well equipped is the alliance to adapt to these new capabilities or range of new capabilities? And so, Clint, again, if you could pull from the report, it would be great to hear sort of how we've thought about this.
Sure, Jenny. And this, as you said, General Chun's remarks, some of them led naturally into this, so I might be hitting some similar points. But the group raised various concerns, which I'll sort of run through now, and they reference in various ways how equipped or maybe not equipped the alliance is. And one important concern, and this was mentioned repeatedly, and I think I sort of alluded to it before, was the vulnerability of fixed infrastructure, both military and civilian. And the group really reiterated again and again that such infrastructure should really be considered strategic infrastructure, and that it directly relates to the alliance's ability to respond both in a crisis, but also in wartime. And that North Korea's advancements and the mobility of some of its shooters, including with solid fuel technology, will exacerbate the issue of defending fixed infrastructure. Another concern, and this has to do with things that I know I've discussed with General Chun, was the longstanding mentality in the ROK military about defending Seoul and fortifying fixed defensive positions. And so the defense of Seoul really needs to be reimagined a bit, and ROK and alliance forces need to be able to fight in a way that mobility and resiliency take precedence over just static defense. And also in this vein, the group recommended rehearsing defense of critical infrastructure and soft targets much deeper within ROK territory in order to sort of rapidly react to soft infiltration. The concern being that North Korea could use a range of techniques, both kinetic and non-kinetic or cyber, to sabotage potable water sources, high-speed transit systems, power grids, South Korea's nuclear reactors to sort of create havoc and civilian casualties. And so where possible, the group recommended that the alliance should try to reduce its reliance on fixed infrastructure, which of course is much easier said than done. So beyond that, the group stressed the need to reduce the vulnerability of such infrastructure and enhance its resiliency, the resiliency of softer targets, by hardening them, but also building strategic reserves of key infrastructure supply chain items like electric power transformers, water stations. The main idea being that there shouldn't be any system that doesn't have a backup ready in place to be plugged in, if possible. The group also recommended, I should just add, to make more robust plans for how to defend infrastructure. And this includes missile defense, but also maneuvering missiles down to less sophisticated priorities like counter special operations forces defense, defending against UAVs, and updating point defense systems like South Korea is currently developing Iron Dome and additional CRAM capabilities. And just another point, one concern, and I think General Lim at least alluded to this in his opening remark, was it revolved around the US and ROK's air and missile defense systems. And the group explored various policy and technical obstacles to their sort of full integration, but it did suggest that improvements can and should be made in better coordinating and creating layers of systems and rehearsing how US and ROK systems would communicate and operate together to ensure that the very best systems don't get wasted on things they don't need to engage in this confused battle space. And then I'll just make one final point. There are many concerns that were raised, but another really salient one was that the focus on wartime OPCON transition and strategic transformation, along, of course, with canceled or scaled down exercises, which I know we'll turn to in a bit, has detracted from the maintenance of the Combined Forces Command and current operations and readiness. And there was also a concern related to this about the lack of a consistent sort of on a daily basis relationship between the ROK JCS and the Combined Forces Command headquarters. So currently this only exists in times of exercises or wartime, but it could become, and it was suggested that it should become, the modus operandi for the day-to-day operation of the alliance's security apparatus. And so this could involve sort of moving aspects of daily operational control or OPCON or armistice OPCON, which are under ROK JCS control, to an operational headquarters and sort of elevate the ROK JCS in the process. And I think this would help not only for greater preparedness, but it would also help move us toward wartime OPCON transition, which was an important piece of the report and our discussions. I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. General Chen, I know like I said, in the last question, you brought up some of the major concerns. How well equipped do you feel that the alliance is, and what are some of the main areas you want to add to this discussion?
So let's divide readiness into a full-scale war situation and provocations. For full-scale war, if we're on the defensive, I think because of the advantages of the defender, despite the advantages of the attacker, South Korea and the alliance would have a better chance of fending off a North Korean attack. And the weapon systems that I mentioned would have less effectiveness, except for the RPGs. Now, the RPG is not a very sophisticated weapon, but you should all look into what the North Koreans have done with their RPGs. They have developed a wide range of warheads, including hyperbolic warheads. Why would anybody want to develop a hyperbolic warhead for an RPG? It's bulky and it's heavy. The only reason is they're preparing for an urban type warfare. Because if you have a hyperbolic warhead and you hit it in a building, anything that's inside that building, at least that floor, is not going to be a threat any longer. So for a full-scale war defensive operations, I feel we have a good chance. For offensive operations, we're seeing exactly what might happen in Ukraine would happen in Korea. Our tanks, which are superior to North Korea's, would be prey to North Korean manned portable weapon, anti-tank weapon systems, which they have a lot of, including the Cornet, the Persa that I was mentioning. And so I think in an offensive operation where we had to go into North Korea, we would have a big challenge. But let's talk about provocation. That's where the South Koreans have been focusing on. Because to be honest with you, in the hearts of the South Korean military, they don't think that it's going to be a full-scale war. And the only reason they play around with Op Plan 5027 is because if they said publicly that there's no threat of a full-scale war, that they don't believe it, their budgets are going to be cut. So they focus on provocations. That's why the South Koreans have more artillery pieces than the Russians. Anyway, by having such a tilted preparedness, the South Korean military, for example, the artillery that we have, there's a section of the artillery mechanism that's called the FDC, the Fire Direction Center. These are the people who get the data for the target, process it, and give it to the guns so that they know the coordinates to shoot at. In most foreign militaries, the FDC is occupied by at least 10 to 20 people. The Koreans, because they have so many artillery units, they have only 5 to 7 people. What this means is two things. Number one, you can't defend your artillery units in the first place with so few people. Secondly, you can fight a battle for maybe 2 days. But if you had 20 people, they could be on shifts of 2 or 3 and get some sleep. But if you only have 5 to 7 people, after 2 days, everybody is not going to know, will be able to count because they have not slept for 48, 72 hours. So these are some of the shortcuts that they've taken. So what we have discussed in our study is very broad, but I just want to reiterate that down deeper, there are fundamental problems and issues, shortcuts that the ROK military has taken that are going to be detrimental to a real war situation. So heaven forbid that happens. And unfortunately, for me as a Korean to say this, it's embarrassing, but the only thing that's keeping us from that kind of situation is the Americans on pen. And I've said it many times, I trust my life with an American soldier, but I would be stupid to trust an American politician, So that's what really is concerning for me. So I just want to give you an example of how I feel that my concerns about, how the South Koreans are prepared for these kind of situations. I hope I don't give you a nightmare.
Well, thank you, General Chen. I'm sure some of these issues have come up before. And certainly you just wrote a piece for us on 38 North as well that did address a little bit of it, talking about the lessons to be learned from what's happening in Ukraine. I do want to remind the audience that's watching at any time, if you want to add questions to the Q&A box, please feel free to do so. We will get to them in a little bit. But when it comes to, this issue of preparedness and this issue of also like getting a little down into the nitty gritty, over the last 4 years, US-ROK joint military exercises have largely stalled for political purposes, raising questions about their overall utility and effectiveness. And so as we start to see exercises resume, presumably on a more regular basis, should we be reconstituting the exercises as they were before 2018 or rethinking our overall strategy and approach? And in addition to that, what are some of the new challenges in this current political and geopolitical environment that future exercises will actually need to address? And General Chan, I will start with you this time.
See, I was not prepared for that. So, once again, I feel that the combined exercises, the alliance did their best to make sure that there was no void in the readiness of the combined operations. But I was a planning officer for 3 years for UFL at that time in 2000. And so I know the importance of combined exercise. And it's not just doing the exercise, it's the whole preparation of the exercise. And so it's about time now that we need to think about, what are we getting for this, sacrifice? And unfortunately, we haven't gotten much. And I think it's time to get back to getting the whole apparatus of the US military into focusing on the Korean Peninsula. And the only way you do that is by having these kind of exercises. Having said that, again, I would like to get your focus down at the soldier level. So one of the problems that we've had on Penn for the past couple of years is live fire for American tanks and American helicopters, especially during the night. This is because of local populations being adamantly against, the sound and all of that. But it's been the same for the ROK military. One of our corps, a corps has 3 or 4 divisions, has not conducted a night tank fire in 10 years. In 10 years, 6 to 7 corps commanders allowed his units not to go and fire at night. This is the reality. American generals don't have the time to look into this. And I beg the American generals to ask questions. When they go to Korean units, they get a great dog and pony show, but they should drill into the questions about, so how many rounds do you fire at night? I mean, we're having problems. How do you overcome it? Oh, we overcome it by not doing it at all, would be the answer. And so, again, we're only as good as the weakest link. There are other issues at the lower level, but another one is what's happened recently under the Moon administration. So under the Moon administration, excuse me, human rights within the military has been emphasized, and rightly so. Well, unfortunately, a byproduct of all of this is that the Korean military was not ready. They were not ready psychologically. So there's been a lot of open accusations by subordinates, which is very unfamiliar within the ROK military. I mean, the ROK military, if a senior officer said something, it was done unquestioned. Not during the Moon administration. Soldiers started questioning, rightfully so, these orders. And so because of this, do you know what happened? The senior officers start giving orders. Let me say it again. They stopped giving orders. They stopped training. So when we're talking about training issues here, it's not just about the combined training, but all the training at the low level. Why would a battalion commander shoot, maybe fire small arms, but why would he shoot a 90mm recoilless rifle that has the potential of blowing up? It's a 1 in a million chance, but why would he do that unless he had to? He's not going to do that. So there are really big problems in the South Korean military. My only hope is that North Korea is more corrupt than we are, and so that they must be having a worse time than we are. So that's my only hope. So I'll end it there.
Thank you, General Chen. I know that in the report, we have some specific recommendations about exercises that are a little bit higher level than the soldier level that General Chen was talking about. Clint, I wonder if you could walk us through a couple of those points.
Sure, and General Chen, this is why we have you here, so you can scare us and paint a doomsday scenario. So our recommendations are that much more appealing, hopefully, and sort of actionable. So again, this sort of circles back to a point, Jenny, that I made earlier about, excuse me, that the consensus that the alliance wasn't conducting sufficient training throughout the entirety of the battle space, with sort of a fixation on defending Seoul and routing priorities to get men and material and equipment north. This could complicate a focus on defending targets and sort of civilian infrastructure further south. And so one recommendation was that the alliance should adjust its exercises to challenge different sectors of critical infrastructure north and south of the Han River, and do so on a sort of rotating structure where the alliance picks different sectors to defend at different times. Another key criticism, and I think General Chen will heartily agree with this, was that there's sort of a long-standing and misplaced optimism about exercises, with successful outcomes that don't necessarily reflect potential reality or civilian casualties, and can instill a false sense of security. So the group recommended that the alliance needs to reorient its thinking about exercises in order to quote unquote train to failure. General Lee mentioned this in his opening remarks. And what this means is to use exercise to expose shortcomings rather than assume success. This would challenge assumptions and hopefully lead to innovative changes in some of the op plans that General Chen referenced. However, such changes would require military leadership be given permission to acknowledge such shortcomings in training and exercises. And this is really a higher level policy decision, and it would require potentially more honest and sort of hard-hitting or pointed discussions held in private by alliance managers. I think this gets a bit to the point General Chen made about maybe more penetrating questions and creating environments where the alliance can, again, not in the open, but get down to nitty gritty a little bit more on just what's being done and what's not being done. One other point I'll mention is, and I think General Chen alluded to this as well, was that the ROK's crisis management exercises, including its support for non-combatant evacuation operations or NEO exercises, have not really been conducted for a matter of years, and this has resulted in a loss of institutional knowledge. And participants in the group noted that the ROK government will often express distinct concern regarding U.S. conducting unilateral actions, and that the U.S. cannot start a war without ROK consent, but that it doesn't participate in the exercises that would help provide them insight into how the U.S. government and U.S. forces decision-making processes sort of function. And so the group recommended strengthening ROK government involvement in NEO exercises and other crisis management exercises in order to learn everything it can about these decision-making processes, and really to sort of better understand that crisis management is about not going to war, but rather managing the situation sort of to maintain the peace. There was also recommendations about building greater combinedness, but I can turn to those later.
All right, thanks, Clint. Natalia, I want to pull you into this conversation as well. Do you want to add to this?
Sure. So thanks, Jenny. I just want to say it was a great learning experience to be part of this military working group and a fantastic opportunity to gain further insight into the US-ROK alliance and its resiliency, especially in light of recent rather turbulent events. So Clinton, General Chen worked off a lot of great points. I just want to reiterate, especially a lack of combinedness and a need to train to failure, which encompasses a challenge that future exercises will need to address. That's specifically been addressed in our report as well. which is that both the US and South Korea should take a whole of government approach. So instead of solely focusing on exercises at higher levels or assuming that training should only deal with defending against artillery and conventional capabilities, using this checkerboard threat assessment, we can understand that North Korea may be willing and able to provoke and attack at these lower levels and different sectors of critical civilian infrastructure that tend to be sticky. So as Clinton General Chun have mentioned, we should implement planning that addresses these fixed infrastructures that are not always tested or strengthened on a regular basis, such as communication systems, civilian energy sectors, emergency services, cyber, water systems and waste treatment, et cetera, that remain vulnerable and are likely to sustain a large amount of damage in the event of a North Korean attack. And this also relates to the training to failure that requires a great amount of cohesiveness and information sharing and discussion at multiple levels of the alliance, including what General Chun mentioned, all the way down to the individual soldier level. And that can be tricky just due to the structure of the alliance and overall chain of command. Some issues include high turnover of personnel, loss of institutional knowledge, and bureaucracy that can lack cohesiveness and stall decision-making processes. But overall, I think it can be addressed by implementing better combinedness on a day-to-day basis, which could be assisted by utilizing the same command and control systems, more regular communication between the US-ROK Infantry Division, CFC Command and HQ, and identifying and addressing those gaps found in the training to failure in the fixed and critical civilian infrastructure at a multitude of levels.
Great, thanks, Natalia. And that actually leads, I think, really well into the next question, which is, one thing that we have seen used in Ukraine is a notable use of cyber attacks. And I think it's really telling about the complexities of modern warfare. So it's not just about conventional weapons and missiles, but cyber and information warfare are the new and hard to predict aspect to consider. We know North Korea has a robust cyber capability. How does this impact defense planning against future conflict or aggression from North Korea? And Natalia, I'm going to stick with you and have you start this off.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So again, this all ties back to building in that day-to-day combinedness and using that whole of government approach, training to failure, and identifying and filling those needs that we see in fixed infrastructure. I briefly mentioned cyber in the last question for the future of exercises. And of course, having that increased and regular information sharing and integration in authority and jurisdiction between the US and ROK's cyber operations is going to be really important. So this utilizing the same command and control systems, potentially designating English as the standard language in these communications, and also bringing together civilian, government, and potentially private companies together might be beneficial in planning against future cyber attacks. Many of the attacks that have gotten notoriety in recent years revolve around generating revenue in hard currency. But North Korea has launched cyber attacks on both public and private sectors in South Korea and elsewhere before. More recently, last June, the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute was exposed to hacking attacks. And in 2014, the Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Company was attacked. And at that time, they supplied over a third of the country's total power. So this leads to the alliance needing a credible cyber deterrent strategy. And in an article that James Platt published on 38 North last November, he had a great quote, simply stating that all malicious North Korean cyber activity is to be deterred is too broad and unrealistic. So while it's impossible to predict and prepare for and stop all potential cyber attacks, the alliance can be strategic in preparing for and deterring against both higher and lower level cyber attacks that could be aimed at the critical infrastructures I previously mentioned. And building off of that, the report has a specific recommendation tying into the idea that Clint mentioned about exercising without warning and at random intervals on different parts of infrastructure, and designing and exercising scenarios that take place in times of peace, not just in times of war, so that these vulnerabilities can be addressed and strengthened before it becomes critical. So tightening cooperation and communication, clearly delegating authority, supporting frequent tests at all different levels will build that resiliency for the alliance as a whole, and in turn will help make the US commitment to the Korean Peninsula more credible and potentially help deter against these future cyber attacks.
Great, thanks, Natalia. There's a lot there to unpack. Clint or General Chun, did either of you have a quick follow-up?
Natalia mentioned a lot of points that I would have hit. I would just maybe reiterate one point that she made, citing James Platt's article, which is, deterrence is often used as sort of this catch-all concept. But when it comes to cyber, deterrence failure is quite common. We've seen that the North Koreans are perfectly willing to use their cyber capabilities in all sorts of malicious ways. And so one key point that the group made is that the alliance should really focus on building in deterrence by denial and sort of resiliency in different systems, and trying to address different seams between the allies. And again, Natalia mentioned this, but the allies use varying C2 systems with different levels of encryption, which means that the networks that they use cannot sort of completely overlap with one another. And this creates exploitable seams, which could be potential entry points that could affect military operations. And another key seam that I'll mention, and then I'll pass to General Chun, that Natalia also alluded to was there's also the seam in addressing North Korea's cyber activities before wartime, so in peacetime. And when South Korea's civilian infrastructure or even military targets are subject to cyber attacks, of course it falls under ROK sovereign national interest and legal jurisdiction. However, there are cases where cyber attacks could result in significant loss of life, and those same targets may fall under the jurisdiction of the alliance and require consultation to address. So this is a sticky, there's a threshold between ROK national interests and authorities and alliance interests and operations that I think that the allies need to work more to look at where those seams are, where those frictions are. And of course, running exercises will help with that. And that includes running exercises, which the alliance has run before, that involve cyber attacks that result in civilian casualties. These are stopped for political reasons. But one of the participants made the point that, in a worst case scenario, the alliance will have wished it had been running these types of tests. I think they're difficult. They need to be explained to the public sort of delicately, but I'll sort of pass with that, Jenny.
Great, thanks. And General Chun, did you have a short comment?
Yeah, I think both comments are great. I just want to add that I'm really surprised at how the Russians were unable to dominate the narrative in the present situation in the Ukraine. I don't think the North Koreans are going to be that stupid, but there's much to be learned in what we're seeing in the Ukraine. To be honest with you, I haven't been able to keep up with the cyber aspect of the Ukraine war. I'm reading up on it, but I find it very interesting. And I also feel that there's going to be a lot of lessons that the South Koreans can learn.
Thank you. I do want to get to audience questions, so I have one more round of questions, and if we could keep it very quick answers. We've discussed a number of vulnerabilities and challenges in ROK allied capabilities against advancing North Korean conventional and WMD and cyber capabilities. So how do we, in this environment, assure the public that the alliance is more than capable of adapting to these new challenges without fueling rivalry with countries like China and North Korea? And Clint, I'll turn to you first to give us some insights from the report.
Sure, and I'll make this quick. I'll let General Chun sort of throw rhetorical bombs at his own country's military. But I think this does relate to a point that he's sort of repeatedly hit. And I think I just want to talk briefly about OPCON transition, wartime OPCON transition. And the report digs into this. It might be one of the longest sections, and I really recommend people to take a look at it if they're interested in that subject. I do think I'm of the mind, and the suggestions in the report, I sort of agree with them. We explored some concerns about the ROK military's the need to address its ability to lead joint and combined and coalition operations, to build greater combinedness, between the CFC HQ and the US-ROK Infantry Division at the component level, and to really start to help posture and stand up the ROK JCS to take a more sort of lead role as OPCON transition in the COTP envisions. I am a firm believer that a lot of deliberate effort should be put into this. And I think this will, of necessity, have a forcing function for the ROK military to begin to address some of the areas that General Chun has mentioned. Not just on sort of a strategic level, but on lower, lesser levels as well, about what it will mean for it to take the so-called lead in the future CFC. I think this will build confidence. It will also, some of the recommendations we've mentioned will help build greater familiarity between ROK generals and the so-called second chain of command, the US chain of command that they'd have to be communicating with regularly, but also help build greater familiarity with US policymakers, with ROK generals and admirals as well, and sort of tighten that communication, which is not happening enough as much as it does happen. And I think that process is a way to, and if it's, there's a sort of a strategic communication plan that communicates to both ROK and US publics, this will, I think, bolster ROK capabilities and confidence in a way that I think it will, like all things do, elicit diatribes from the North. But I think it will, instead of the perception will be that the reality will be that the ROK is, I don't want to say standing up on their own, because that's patronizing and they're already quite capable, but more so than they have to this point. And so less relative dependence on the US taking certain lead roles, but the alliance being strengthened and being made more enduring as a result of it. I'll sort of stop there, but I think OPCON transition, it is, after all, a bilaterally agreed to alliance policy that successive presidents, US and ROK, have signed off on. I think the alliance really needs to think hard about how they're gonna move this ball forward.
Thanks, Clint. General Chun?
Yeah. So how do we assure the public? Well, showing a strong ROK-US alliance is probably the best start. And I would also add that at the tactical level, we have combined training, not exercises, training, which is, soldier to soldier stuff. But I would think that expanding that would be great. Also, the Katyusha program, which has been weakened because of the size reduction. I think there needs to be an expansion of Katyusha's size. I mean, the USFK surely could use more Katyushas. It's the ROK government that's reduced it, so we need to turn back that tide, those things. But at the same time, I really feel that the Korean military needs American help in convincing Korean politicians of how the alliance, how the Korean military can become better. And the only way the American military can do that is to know what the situation is at the ground level on Korean units. So after the dog and pony show, American officers really need to dig in. American NCOs already know a lot. And so find out the ground truth and help the Korean military whereby US military officers and NCOs talking to Korean politicians. Thanks.
Thanks, General Chen. Natalia, did you have a final short comment?
Yeah, so I think Clinton, General Chen covered basically everything, and I would just want to reiterate that public outreach and education, I think, is essential to assure both US and ROK citizens and politicians that the US-ROK alliance concerns are being addressed and that potential threats are being prepared against, while balancing that with reassurance for local regional actors such as China and Russia that there isn't any need for panic or posturing. And that's part of why I think this working group and report were so important. One specific recommendation the group had that's in the report is that the South Korean government could strengthen its involvement in non-combatant evacuation operations. Those haven't been conducted, I think, for 2 years. So this would help on the more ground level that General Chen mentioned in aiding institutional knowledge, information sharing, letting ROK policymakers air concerns regarding the US potentially conducting unilateral actions, which nobody wants, and just sharing information on decision-making processes between the two countries.
Great, thanks, Natalia. And thank you all for a great discussion. Like I said, I do want to get to some audience questions here. So the first one comes from John Kim, and he asks, regarding CFC, is there any interest in expanding this relationship should a country like Canada express an interest in increasing its presence and responsibilities in Korea? General Chen, why don't I start with you?
No, because we have the United Nations Command. Why should we include the Combined Forces Command with other countries? Now, having said that, we do have Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, great countries sending officers to help us even now. Not to the degree that that you might be thinking of, but if we were to expand, the logical answer would be to the United Nations Command and not to the Combined Forces Command. So the short and simple answer is no.
Great, General Brooks, did you want to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, General Chunenbaum is exactly right. That's why UN Command exists. It's fundamentally different than the construct that happened from 1950 up until 1978. UN Command is the home for international commitments. Canada has already made significant commitments. The initial deputy commander, for example, for the first time, not an American, happened during the time that I was there in 2017 and continues to this day. 3 different nations have taken over that position. They're very senior in their militaries. Indeed, the first one, General Wayne Eyre, has gone on to become not only the Chief of Army, but now the Chief of Defense Forces for Canada. So when countries like Canada, UK, Australia, and any others who might come in successive years want to commit their militaries, their knowledge, their experiences into the Korean Peninsula, it's done through UN Command. And this is an important point as we think about UN Command's future. Well, its role is very, very important in this regard, no matter what the mission set is, whether it's preserving the armistice or engaging in military demilitarization, once again, of North Korean and South Korean and US forces. I mean, that could happen as an oversight mission, just as it did with the Military Armistice Commission in 1953. So it's very important to recognize that. Last point I would say on this is the Combined Forces Command is a binational command that is really the manifestation of a mutual defense treaty agreement. So unless there is a mutual defense treaty that adds another country to that binational one, then there wouldn't be room for them. Providing support to CFC, certainly there's a role for that, for other countries in the world who were like-minded to do that, but they would do that through UN Command.
Jenny, can I just quickly add to that? So I agree completely, and it's UNC the conduit through which this can happen. I'd like to see if I could recommend something directly to the ROK government, even more ROK involvement in the UNC. When we talk about sort of bolstering coalitional capabilities and leadership, and this is a politically fraught issue. I'm fully aware of this, and the UNC revitalization campaign, and it's fraught with both progressives and conservatives. Anyway, I would like to see that, and I think when we talk about bolstering the ROK's coalition capabilities, when we think about a future CFC and OCCON transition, the UNC has everything to do with that. And so through that, I would love to see the ROK actually build its relationships with, not through the binational CFC with the US, of course, continue that, but build relationships with the Aussies, with the Canadians, with the UK through the UNC. I think this would sort of open an aperture for sort of a wider view about ROK leadership on and around the peninsula in this multilateral institution.
Great, thanks, Clint, and thank you, Generals, for clarifying that. One question that's come up is the importance of exercises and cooperation between US and ROK forces were mentioned throughout the various presentations, throughout the discussion, with the need for more robust US focus. The question is, with growing US interest in Europe and a continued focus on China, will US strategy, US government have enough attention left to focus on the peninsula? Who wants this? Clint, I'm going to put you on the spot to start.
Yeah, well, my visceral response is it better. Obviously, this is a constant concern. Obviously, right now, because of the crises that the world is facing in Europe, it's an acute concern, but it's a consistent one on the Korean Peninsula. Is the U.S. paying sufficient attention? Because historically speaking, the attention is often episodic, and it takes a crisis to sort of retrain attention. I'm going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I think moving towards OCCON transition is a way to, just looking at past instances where deliberate effort was put into this, there was a really productive evolution in the alliance. And for various reasons, those efforts were sidetracked. It's bureaucratic, political, evolution of the North Korean threat. But when a lot of time and energy was put into that effort, it really forced fundamental questions about the division of labor in the alliance and sort of really how to evolve this thing. And so I think if the US government can delegate regional focused officials to really sink their teeth into how they can move this along, I think it will, because again, it requires the ROK to start to think about the wider regional array and not just the bilateral relationship. And I think this will help shore up the alliance and other US allies and partners' cooperation in the region. And this would, of necessity, and again, I know it's a political it's fraught, this would also require greater ROK and Japan cooperation, especially when we talk about the UNC and how the command might evolve moving forward, the CFC, that is, with the ROK leader, a ROK commander, a ROK general or admiral as the commander. I don't know if that addresses the question, but that's what comes to mind.
I would also add to this question in terms of, I think the US government is more than capable of walking and chewing gum.
Yeah.
And I think there is.
Agreed.
There is a lot here where, some of it does depend on South Korea as well. And I think, President-elect Yoon has indicated, as you've mentioned, a greater interest in expanding the alliance, especially beyond the military, deepening the alliance cooperation overall, and providing some clarity on where it stands between US and China. I think it will also require the US, of course, to uphold that and support that decision along the way as well, because there's obviously going to be some friction that it will cause in that process with countries like China. General Brooks, did you want to weigh in here also?
Just a brief point to add. This is one of the great things about an alliance. So South Korea's focus is always on North Korea and sometimes on the rest of the world. The US focus is always on the rest of the world and sometimes deeply on North Korea. It never comes off of North Korea, but as has been stated, it's sometimes episodic in terms of the degree of concentration that's on North Korea at a given point in time. Candidly, I believe that's a bigger concern for Kim Jong-un than it is for South Korea and the United States. And that some of the demonstrations recently could have as a component a desire to not let that international focus drift away from North Korea, because progress cannot be made for North Korea's situation by North Korea if there's not attention focused on it, particularly the attention of the United States. So we'll see this move from time to time. A crisis does tend to cause both countries to concentrate heavily and nearly fully on North Korea. But Jenny, you're right. The alliance, not just the United States, can walk and chew gum on this. And when you're partner of, or when you're ally rather of a global power, you can't expect to have the attention continuously there.
Great. So some of the questions, there's one to General Chun. Do you feel if North Korea should strike, would they be acting on their own, or would China back them either on the ground or supply fighter jets and general war supplies? And might that elicit a different scenario? Plus, with having much of the US military assets being at Camp Humphreys now, does that make it more vulnerable?
So I think if China were to get it involved to that kind of level, it would be totally against all the common sense that we have right now for planning. So I would not anticipate that kind of level of involvement by the Chinese. Now, having said that, would the Chinese provide the North Koreans with moral support? Of course. Intelligence? Probably. And some equipment, spare parts? Yep, clandestinely, sure. For cyber warfare, the Chinese have to allow the North Koreans some, wavelength or whatever. Yeah, they will probably do that. As long as North Korea's interests and Chinese interests are the same, probably they would. I'm sure they would do that. So I think initially that would be the Chinese involvement. And if the Chinese were impetuous enough to up that ante, then the whole situation for that kind of a war would be catastrophic, not only for Korea, but for everyone. What was the second question?
Oh, does the size of Camp Humphreys and having a concentration of US military assets at Camp Humphreys make it vulnerable?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that, and you would be, it's natural to be concerned about that. But I think, especially to our adversaries, they need to understand something. If they attack Camp Humphreys, they're not just attacking a military base, they're attacking American families. Now, you Americans are very hard to get to war, but if you kill a 7-year-old American child, the spirit of the Americans will be awakened. When that happens, everybody knows that beware. So if anybody is stupid enough to attack Camp Humphreys while there are civilians, family members, children there, it would be really, really, ignorant of the characteristics of the United States. So to me, I think getting this word out is very important. And probably Camp Humphreys and the city of Pyeongtaek is one of the most safest places in Korea, because if North Korea or China knew of these facts, they would steer clear away until NEO is completely.
Oh, I think you were cut off right at the end, but I think we got the point.
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry.
All right. let's move to the next question. So there are serious repercussions for generating air power when building ROK capabilities with US assets like F-35Cs. So for a myriad of reasons, including dependence on critical components available exclusively from US strategic industrial base, does the ROK Air Force not see their F-35s as their own? And how do we better increase interoperability for ROK military to be an effective stand-in force partner now during competition?
Is that for me?
I think we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I think the South Koreans should start maintaining F-35s on the Korean Peninsula and welcome Japanese F-35s to come to Korea and be repaired as well. By doing this, the Americans get a great aircraft logistical repair shop in Korea. We've already had many decades of experience in maintaining, repairing aircraft. F-35s, the United States. Right now, we send everything back to the United States. Why should we? If we had a repair shop here, we could provide services for the U.S. Air Force in the Pacific, and throw in the Japanese, better relations, all of that. So my idea for that single piece would be, we need to start thinking about having some kind of a maintenance, repair, whatchamacallit thing on the Korean Peninsula for F-35s.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question and hopefully we can do sort of a lightning round with all of our panelists. So the question is, we've seen how changing administrations and changing political winds can affect how our two countries' militaries work together at all levels. And so what does the panel believe might be the best way to increase engagement and interest in military readiness from the political camps in both the US and ROK? Clint, I'm going to start with you.
I mean, I think as things stand right now with the transition in South Korea and the Yoon administration entering office, and how the Biden administration has approached allies in South Korea specifically, those conditions are set. I mean, I think we're going to see tighter cooperation. Sometimes I do worry, though, that there's nice rhetoric about cooperation and working on things, but behind it, there's a degree of policy drift, just because there's tighter sort of discursive cooperation, but that can lead to a sort of false sense of security, or even drift where we don't then actually get down to hard issues and start to really look at things closely. So quite frankly, how do we do that? Well, we do things like we're doing right now, and we produce reports that have concrete recommendations. And then we have people like General Chun who talk about more nitty-gritty applications of those. And we try to force more difficult discussions. This is a long-standing alliance with lots of inertia built into it for a host of reasons. And there are sort of lots of blame to go around for why that is. But I think we're at the point now where the alliance is as ironclad as people say, but to me, that also means that it's ready to have difficult discussions about division of labor, about standing the ROK up in ways, and evolving it and moving it forward. I do think the conditions, though, just to circle back, are set for that to happen politically as we speak. Who knows in 2 years and 4 years?
Thanks, Clint. Natalia?
Yeah, so just very quickly reiterating what Clint just mentioned, I think everyone would love to see tighter cooperation in actions and demonstrations and not just rhetoric and words. I'm very interested to see how President Yoon, as kind of an outsider to politics, will utilize the people around him and how his advisors will guide him into relations with the US, especially following a more progressive South Korean administration and then at the very opposite end of the spectrum, what we had with President Trump. So I'm interested to see what's going forward, but what was the phrase that everyone was using over the last 4 years? Cautiously optimistic?
That's great. General Chen?
Yes, so I think for me, I would welcome a more assertive United States in Korean military affairs. Now, politically, all that, I know you guys are hands off, but within the Korean military side, American sons and daughters are here. And if the Koreans make a mistake or are unprepared, your sons and daughters will be in danger. So I think it is only natural that your leadership should ask, hey, how much ammunition do you have? Is the fuel gauge full or half full? I think those are legitimate, bona fide questions that an American military leader should and could ask. If I were one, I would sure ask. So by doing that, it would give a good reason for the South Korean military to ask for these kind of things that they want to ask, but they can't because of various reasons to their political leaders. So directly and indirectly, I think that's how that can help in that fashion. Thanks.
Thank you, General Chen. And we're going to have to leave the discussion there for tonight. Thank you to our panelists and to General Brooks for being here, and for all of those who did participate in our working group over the last year. I want to also thank our 38 North staff and KDVA staff who helped with tonight's logistics, and to our brilliant translators. For those of you who are listening in Korean, Jamie Wright and David Kim. Have a great evening, everyone. We do hope you'll read the report. It's on 38 North's website, and we hope we'll see you at future events.